to express the transcendental essence of existence in another way, what would you say?
Well, a simple, direct way would be the word, the capital W, the logos that became flesh. That logos would be a brief way of stating it, I think. But the realization of the logos as transcendental essence of existence is, as it were, a function of history. It's a function of the Incarnation. Right? And so I would say that the Incarnation not only effectively, historically, in history, clarifies thought, but in the clarification of thought, it clarifies the understanding of the logos. That it, right? So does that make any sense?
Yes,
it's something like that.
It's the transcendental essence of existence was just.
You mean it's a mouthful? As
Absolutely.
A mindful.
Absolutely.
Oh, well, if you mean it in that way, you mean to try, well...
No, not only that. I also I wanted to know what exactly you meant by it.
Well, that I think would be an easy reference. Now, I think the problem with the phrase is that it's a mouthful or mindful. That is, it's a phrase that can be parsed itself, right? In other words, so how to parse transcendental essence of existence is another question. I didn't think you were asking that question, but that's certainly something that, in effect, I think we're trying to do in the text. I don't know whether we just abstract it and attack it by itself. It takes us back to this question of the transcendental itself, as opposed to, or distinguished at least from the transcendent, as a right, and as the realm, in one way or another, of consciousness. I think you could say, in a Kantian sense, prior to experience. So it's from a Kantian perspective, it's kind of the a priori mind, and the transcendent then would be the world experienced in that, or by that consciousness. I think fundamentally, I think that notion, that way of understanding the term is recapitulated in Husserl. And in the thinking now occurring, I think that's the intellectual point of reference for the use of the term here. So, but I take it back in the historical analysis here, which I've done on a couple of levels in class, not always in the book, to most importantly historically to Aquinas. And what I'm saying is that in effect the transcendental reason begins with Aquinas, not quite in the deliberate way in which it is revisited or redone in Kant, but in effect, that's what I'm saying Aquinas is doing. He is actually thinking in the context of what we can understand as the transcendental form of reason, and then I further qualify that in Aquinas' case as the transcendental form of natural reason. And then just to redo this little historical dance, and Descartes then is understood as a transcendental reason prescinding from the natural part of that. Right? So, to go back to your original question, the appearance of the transcendental essence in time, transcendental essence of existence in time, would be a way of speaking of the logos in becoming flesh in the language of John's Gospel, right? Which is not to say that at that time, so to speak, when that there would have been a philosophical consciousness of the logos incarnate as a revelation. I mean, it's a revelation clearly, but not necessarily a revelation of as it were, a new way of understanding, or a new form of reason, a new form of consciousness, if you want. Right? It takes time, so to speak, for that to be clarified. Right? So,
This was helpful.
okay.
You did clarify something.
Okay. Okay. Were you going to say something?
I was just going to ask you to say again what you said about the logos, and you just said it again. But could you say it a third time? Just briefly.
Well, I said a few things. So,
But the transcendental existence.
well, I'm saying that
Essence of existence.
my first answer to Waltraud was
Yes.
that the transcendental essence of existence is the logos
Yes.
that becomes flesh.
Yeah.
And then I wanted to, and then I without parsing that phrase again.
Yeah.
But the other point I was trying to make was that I think part of the whole point of this text is that it's only now, with the kind of perfect clarity, that one can appreciate intellectually that the logos is the transcendental essence of existence, although previously in the history of thought, the clarity that we now have was approximated, as it were, in various earlier forms, the most critical form being the thinking of Thomas, and then the modern appropriation of that understanding, that effective understanding, not necessarily a deliberate understanding on Thomas's part, I think, becomes deliberate in modern consciousness, right? The first deliberate appropriation of that understanding of reason is Descartes, and then Kant's improvement, as it were, of Descartes, and then Hegel's improvement of Kant. It's something like that. And then I guess Husserl's way of trying to improve or clarify further is in that train. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very helpful to me. And now I want to ask another question. So if we see the clarification in the history of Western philosophy,
Right.
where else might we see that clarification?
When you say where else, meaning what?
I mean, let me ask you what happens to, I don't want to use the word theology, but
Right.
just Christian doctrine, starting with Paul. I mean, can one talk about a history of Christian doctrine?
Oh,
in that
sure, there
sense?
is. Yes, yes, but which is not my forte, so
Yeah.
to speak. But yes, there is such a thing, and then so if you're looking at it that way, I mean, yes, there's a history of Christian doctrine, and there is, even if you stay within the Thomistic Catholic side of that at the moment, there's a development of doctrine and a development of theological understanding. So, for example, Thomas would not be quite so clear on the modern Catholic notion that the child exists from the moment of conception. So now that becomes a theological principle in Catholicism, certainly, in a way that it wasn't true for Thomas. So there is a development, and if you want, a clarification of theology going on, and then a very obvious one, which I more or less just take for granted, which is the whole political and social clarification that is taking place as a consequence of the impact of thought on politics and general self-understanding, and so right. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot that could be done there, and I'm sure it has been done, but it goes beyond the scope of the thinking now occurring, because the thinking now occurring attempts to deal with the most fundamental level of the history of thought without getting into, so to speak, either historically or at the moment, the political, social, theological consequences, right? Because it's another whole set of projects which I think is certainly beyond me.
But then you also say that the new thinking implies the theology and philosophy losing their respective distinctions.
Yeah, I do say that. That's right. Yeah, but I would say that is, well, I'm saying that is clearly the case today in the context of thinking now occurring. I think I don't know how directly I say it in one part of one text or another.
Somewhere.
Maybe somewhere I do say I certainly think, and I probably say it cryptically, if not directly, that really the essence of modern philosophy is theological. Right? In other words, now I wouldn't have to make that case with somebody like Hegel, but there's a lot of modern thinking which we're not dealing with here that would be, I guess, ignorant of that fact. Right? Right? So in other words, we are the heirs of a history that has created for us a consciousness into which, in some sense, you and I and everybody else have been born, right? And education, one of the purposes of education is in general, to try and raise the question that, hey, it hasn't always been this way. That there is such a thing as history, and I think that cuts a number of different ways. If it hasn't always been this way, there's an upside to that. It doesn't have to stay this way, right? So I mean, in the modern world, slavery still exists, but in the modern world, there's no support for it intellectually. There's no legal support for it, and there's no intellectual support for it. It goes back to Adam's question about the wall. Well, there are still walls, but the intellectual support for those walls is gone in the thinking now occurring altogether. So I'm going a little beyond the question. Yeah.
Okay. I follow all of this, but I had a fairly simple thing in my mind that I was thinking as the transcendental essence of existence. So let me just say it in case I'm completely off. That the transcendental essence of existence means that existence has a transcendental essence in the sense of creation.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, okay. But so this is unpacking the logos.
Yeah. Right. Okay.
Yeah, because go back to John's Gospel.
Yeah.
In the beginning was the Word, and the
it's
Word
obviously
with God, and everything that has come into being through the Word. So the Word is understood as the context.
Well, it's a recapitulation textually of the opening of Genesis.
Right.
Obviously.
Right. Yeah. Right. Okay.
I have a simple question about what do you mean by transitive? And if we're reading this part, then it'll be answered.
Hopefully it will.
Okay. So I'd just like to invite.
So we have on the list.
Okay, on the
transitive, predicament, nullification, annulment.
Okay, I don't think we can avoid
appropriation.
Appropriation. I don't think it's as problematic as these other terms. Appropriation is just taking to oneself. So the problem intellectually in the context of thinking now occurring of appropriation, the real problem with appropriation is the app part of it,
right?
Not the appropriation part, right? Not the notion of property is not anathema, but that it's self, that the property is a self or a self-related property or properness of the person. That's the problem. So appropriation is seen in this context, as it were, if I can be Hegel a moment, it's a bad thing because it's still tied fundamentally to the notion of self-consciousness. Okay. I want to, not surprisingly, back up a little bit because we had so many interesting questions last time that there are a couple of things we didn't get to that I think are relatively important. And so backing into beta for a moment, on page 341, let's take the second paragraph, the first paragraph beginning on 341. I think we were on this page, but for a different reason last time. The word is spoken in essence. The creation formally is thought for the first time in history. The essentially unconditioned actuality of the appearance of faith itself, essentially repeated in the essence of history. The irreducible element in the Eucharist of existence. Now that's a theme that's central to Gamma, so we'll save that part. The divinity itself is the fact in essence of the acceptance of being itself in the Word, together with which in the substantiality of faith is implicitly the exaltation of being itself, together with being at the disposal of another. the fact that thinking is able to conceive in essence the Eucharist of existence in which it exists implicitly as the moment of absolute objectivity in thought without contradiction is intelligible in terms of the fact that difference no longer depends upon transcendence. The difference in essence is not between two or three things transcendentally identical. There is no transcendent interval, no interstice, however wide, no merely formal indifference to the apartness of things, no merely ideal energy of thought itself dwelling in the eternal recess of things. In essence, there is no time out, which we've said in discussion in a different context. There is now nothing but the transcendent identity of thought's object, upon which thought now concentrates in essence, essentially without interruption. This identity is conceived to be the beginning, transcendentally differentiated, of a completely new universe. All right, so there are a number of ways in which I've, in class, characterized the thinking now occurring. One of them, which again is relevant to Gamma, as the beginning of the resurrection. Right. So another way of understanding that is put out here as the beginning of a completely new universe, associating the resurrection with the notion of a new heaven and a new earth. So this would be, as it were, the intellectual equivalent of a new heaven and a new earth, a completely new universe. And the key notion that's being developed in this passage that I've read is that the difference in the thinking now occurring is not transcendent to the thinking, that the difference is transcendental, going to the notion that there is a kind of that the little image that I like to use of the discontinuous circle, as it were, the discontinuous unity, right? Put it in terms of Gamma, the unity of the body, right? Which would be a little more concrete way of speaking of this circle. The unity of the body is not a unity founded in continuity, but is a unity which is founded in the discontinuous, essential differentiation of existence. You could say that existence with a CE and a TS simultaneously, so that that in turn related to the notion, to try and be clear on this, that this kind of absolute differentiation of existence itself is not, as you might otherwise suspect, it's not at the expense of identity, right? So that the infinite differentiation is, as it were, the essential structure of identity. And in that sense, I found an interesting phrase in today's assignment, which I had to read slowly to make sure it was correct, having to do with the fact that I don't know what I said in the resurrection, but just to cut to the chase, in the resurrection, as it were, or in the thinking now occurring insofar as it essentially anticipates the resurrection itself. The other existing exists without reference, in essence, to another. And the reason and maybe we'll pick it up when we get to that section of the text, but the reason I'm thinking about it now is the subtlety here, the potential difficulty is to understand that in the kind of absolute completion that the thinking now occurring is the beginning of, but insofar as it is the beginning of, remains in some important, if extremely subtle sense, different than, in that ultimate finality, as it were, that utter finality, I think it's the way I put it in the text, there is to be an otherness which in a certain sense is not essentially referential even, is which now I'm thinking of Bernadette Roberts, which however is not to be understood as it might appear in the framework of self-consciousness, right, as beyond distinction, beyond difference, but it's to say that the difference is so absolutely real, now put it crudely, that at that point there's nothing to talk about, right? In other words, the absolute differentiation of the creation, the ultimate, utter finality of that is such that the otherness is absolute beyond even the necessity, as it were, or even the opportunity for other reference, right? So it's a kind of absolute immediacy of an actual differentiation. Okay.
When you have this would preclude all the kinds of differentiation which depend upon predicates that are part of a set of systematic relationships. For instance, husband and wife, father and son, child and adult. Those differentiations don't have any meaning without the system of their relations. So what you're saying is that the site in which the thinking is the object is a site that is, as it were, deeper than those kinds of predications of things.
Right. Yes.
That the actual materiality of the mother is there, and the child is there, and the husband is there, and the thinking now occurring goes all the way to the way in which they're there, apart from the ways in which they relate to each other by those predicates.
Well, what I want to say, yes, in a way that it is, as it were, there is no need to do, there's no need for, or no need, you might even say no possibility of distinguishing the mother from the predicate, the substance from the predicate. Now, if we go way back in the course, we're now talking about something that characteristically, historically, is the way in which God is understood, right? Certainly by Augustine. And so what's being said here is that in the utter finality of the fact, as it were, which in traditional terms, just to make it concrete, would be like when you go to heaven, right? When one is face to face with God, there is, and this is this you'll find in Thomas, right? There is a deification of the creature, right? So that the creature becomes divine, if I put it in Augustinian terms. Now, the key thing for Augustine, and you say, well, wait a minute, that sounds good. Maybe Augustine should have been brought up before the Inquisition, right? But no, because for Augustine, that one remaining difference is all you need. That the divine did not become divine. So the distinction between God and the creature, even in that ultimate state of the creature having really become divine, and therefore, in the context of this intellectual discussion, that would mean, in some way, that now it's not only true of God that there's no distinction between the substance and the predicate when it comes to the divine, but likewise the creature at that stage, there's no, similarly, takes qua divine, loses that difference. Okay? And I just want to finish, make sure I got Augustine covered there. But Augustine's point would be, okay, yes, but the becoming is a sufficient distinction.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Right, but I'm not. Are you saying that the multiplicity of predicates that would ordinarily be contradictory or require a system of relations can adhere in the substance without those relations? I mean, in other words, it's just it's sort of an ordinary sense of meaning so-and-so.
Well, if you phrase the question that way, then I want to say yes. That's what I'm saying.
Okay,
I'm not entirely comfortable with the notion of the predicate inhering in the substance.
Oh, okay, all right. Okay. But whatever, however you would say.
Right.
I mean, you have in just different kinds of modern logic. You have logics which take relations first, and logics which take, substances first.
Right.
So do you reduce relations to substances, or do you take relations first and then you, in a sense, reduce substances to relations?
Right. And I want to say ultimately, we don't want to have them as alternatives so that we have to take one before the other. We want to understand them as identical. The substance.
Okay, that's okay. But I'm still trying to see what it is that's being removed in the discontinuous circle. Because you were using the circle as an image for the system of relations.
Right.
And I'm not sure what it is that's,
I think because
deleted there.
I think we're talking about two different things. And that's why I say this is part of the problem of gamma. Gamma is trying to do more than it probably should. The circle that I've been using, and it comes up again. The circle doesn't come up as an image here, but we're talking about the essential distribution of existence. Wherever you find the term distribution here, which comes a couple of times in our reading, that image that I'm using of the discontinuous circle is a good image for what's going on at that point in the text. So I would make the distinction between that usage, which has very much to do with the thinking now occurring as such, right? And so what is missing there is not what we were just talking about. In other words, in the case of the utter finality of the fact, which is essentially anticipated in the thinking now occurring. Okay. In the case of the utter finality of the fact, which is essentially anticipated in the thinking now occurring, in that case, the otherness, the absolute otherness, will be substantial, so that among all those others, there will be no thought of other reference. Whereas in the thinking now occurring, which essentially anticipates that state, what's missing, is the connectedness of the others. But what is not missing in that discontinuous circle is the reference to others.
Is there any way that you could make an actual example of how that applies? I mean, it's at a certain point, it's abstract beyond what's bearable.
I'm not sure example is a good
What's
word
the bite?
here. I don't know whether it's going to be helpful or not. I just been writing a little paper on the person, and some of this we've talked about. If you take Kierkegaard's notion of the single individual, Den Enkelte in the Danish, which has the notion of simple, has the notion of particular, sometimes, depending on the context, we'll have the notion of singular, right? What I was doing was, which we've done in here, I tried to make very clear that really you can't understand Kierkegaard without reference to Hegel and without understanding how profoundly in agreement at some level Kierkegaard was with Hegel. That is, Hegel's construction of reality and reason and so forth and so on. And therefore, when he wants to go beyond Hegel, he is so completely Hegelian that he can only do so by becoming self-avowedly absurd, right, when he steps outside of reason. Okay. And so, but a less dramatic way of understanding Kierkegaard, as I said in here, I was thinking of this in a number of contexts. I said that Kierkegaard is in the business of existing the abstraction, and Alia said, is that possible? Okay, existing the Hegelian abstraction, right? So not so much disagreeing with Hegel's understanding of what it means to be human, but reducing it from an abstraction to actually living it, actually embodying it, right? In the particular single case of this existing individual. Okay. So in that context, in this little paper that I put together, wanting to be a little more technical about it, to go back to Hegel and say, a little more technically, what is it that Kierkegaard's individual is existing in Hegel? And what it is, and we've discussed it in here in a simple way by saying that Hegel's great move in the history of thought, probably in a certain sense the fundamental move, although he's got a lot of books, maybe at the heart of his thinking is this notion of sublation, supersession, annulment, the Aufhebung, that by which the destruction or consummation or consumption, literally, of something, it's being reduced to nothing in itself, nothing for itself, right? Having no truth of its own, is, however, its truth in the context of the infinite, right? So the nothingness of the finite, to put it directly, the non-being of the finite is the being, says Hegel, of the absolute or of the infinite, right? Now, in the logic, he actually has a little section, in his science of logic in particular, I think this, if my memory serves it correctly, but it's in the logic too. It's everywhere here and there in Hegel, but in a very central way in the science of logic, he has a little articulation of this movement in which the infinite, and here you think of, you read Hegel, you got to think of Kierkegaard, the infinite in undergoing the negative negation of the second moment. Hegel calls that the abyss. So the infinite, so to speak, going through the abyss comes out, right, through that movement, comes out, and here's what Hegel says, self-equal and immediate. Right? It's, in other words, you could say, if I put it simply, what Hegel is saying is that the divine reality, which is the truth of everything for Hegel, the neatness of it, the simplicity of it, you see, is that the divine goes through within itself a proof of its own existence. It proves its own existence, you see, by creating, if I put it in theological terms, by creating a world that has no truth of its own. And the world's recognition of its own nothingness is the way in which the reality of the absolute is demonstrated. But of course, from Hegel's perspective, this is a self-proof, a self-demonstration. So that the result of the proof is that the absolute is, as he says, self-equal, equal to itself, and immediately so. Because why? Because the so-called middle term, the world, right, has been reduced to nothing. Right? So by that acknowledgement, it goes through a movement, the product of which, as it were, is an immediate self-equality. Right? That's part of the paradox of the Hegelian dialectic. If you think of it in those terms, Kierkegaard's single individual is Kierkegaard's notion of existing that, not challenging Hegel's notion about the divine, as it were, proving immediately itself in its self-equality, it's the truth of its being, do you see? But the single individual then walks around in Denmark trying as a concrete existing individual to prove in the nothingness of its own life, right, in undergoing the abyss in its own subjectivity to prove the existence of the divine. Right, you see? All right. Now, this is a long answer to your question, and but you wanted something. This is about as concrete as I'm going to get. Okay. So if Kierkegaard's single individual is a particularization of the singularity and simplicity of the divine self-demonstration, right? But now done concretely, and the upshot of that is a self-equality and an immediacy, right? Then if I look to Peirce, because that's the next important move here in the history of thought, when I cross from we're speaking of persons now, right? There are a lot of other things in Peirce, right? But Peirce has some comments to make about individual persons, which is all. This is all relevant to particularity in the thinking now occurring, okay? Because I say somewhere, although it hasn't come up in this class, I don't know why. I'm sure I say somewhere. Maybe I don't say it until foundation that being is a person. Okay. Which raises some real problems, because are you serious? Is this a person? Okay. Is a machine a person? Now, the thinking now occurring says in some real way that the machine is a person. There's a person in some real way, not in any simplistic way, right? But in any event, the thinking now occurring in a certain sense is quite relevant, it seems to me, to some of our everyday worldly concerns. However, so Peirce is interested in persons in his own way. Not quite so sharply so because he's a communitarian. Right? He's like Jefferson, who thinks that Epicurus is a good guy, but second best, because Jesus, who teaches the doctrine of love, which has to do with my relationship with others, right? He takes precedence in Jefferson's mind, although Jefferson will not have love without self-interest, right? Without Epicurus. Okay, so Peirce recapitulates that very American notion of the priority of the community to the individual. So now in the process of defining, effectively defining the person, and this anticipates Mead, George Herbert Mead, who is the American social psychologist, who is referenced in the appendix to Faith and Philosophy. This is not perfectly Mead, but Mead and he are in the same ballpark. What Peirce says is that, who was talking about the child? Were we talking about the child when we came in? Child. The development of the child? Was it you? Somebody? Piaget. Yeah, did you mention that?
Yeah.
Okay. Peirce says, based on the psychological studies of his day, that it appears that the child only lately develops a self-consciousness. And Peirce's explanation of that is that the child becomes aware of it. And I think, and the important thing, this all kind of reminds me also of Mead, of course, who doesn't exist outside of the context of Peirce. And Peirce says, and it's clear that the child is thinking before it develops this notion of itself, because it's dealing with the world. It's in contact with things, moving things around, breaking things and stuff like that. Hegel says when a child breaks something, that's a sign that it's rational. The destructiveness of the child is a sign of its rationality. So Peirce says, so when the child becomes aware of itself, when it discovers that others around it in the environment are able to know the truth of things in a way that it isn't. In other words, when mommy says, don't touch that, it's hot, the child, not having itself experienced the stove, right, thinks that the stove is not hot, that mommy's wrong, touches the stove, now discovers its own error, its own ignorance, and becomes aware of itself, says Peirce, as opposed to mommy or the environment, others in the environment. Okay. So Peirce unqualifiedly says, therefore, that, and he has no great love of the self, which means he's on the way to the thinking now occurring, right? But he doesn't quite make it. But he has a nicely negative notion of self, right? Self is what happens when I'm in error, right? In other words, when I'm not, to go back to something we talked about last time, when I'm not in agreement with the general experience of others, right? That's myself. Myself is the center of my ignorance and my error. Do you see? Okay. So, for Peirce, I want to say the true self, if I can put it that way, use a kind of updated Aristotelian term, and Peirce almost speaks this way. The true self is going to be the immortal self. Or let's put it this way, if you're going to be immortal, you better be not a true self. I'm contradicting myself. The true person will be immortal, but immortality consists in that long run where the original generality of nothing in particular is now ideally at the other end post, which we never actually arrive at. What happens? We have the ultimate, absolute, ideal specification, determination, I would say particularization, do you see, of what was the unqualified generality from which this movement, this evolutionary movement started. All right? So in that ideal end place, what I have is a coincidence, right, of a fully particularized and fully intelligible reality of secondness and thirdness are identified in the end. Now, this end is never arrived at because the ideal end place requires the exhaustion of firstness, right? Now, because Peirce will never separate, finally, the three categories, we're never actually going to arrive there. But anyway, go back to the ideal. So the American ideal turns out, ironically, but very much in keeping with Jefferson's Jesus morality, do you say, and Peirce's notion of a evolutionary cosmic love, right? It turns out to be the ideal end place is a place of a kind of perfect particularity, you see, which is the ultimate reality and therefore the ultimate intelligibility of everything that will actually come to be beyond change, you know, kind of arrive at an eternal ideal state. Never will actually happen, by the way. I have to keep saying that. But if it were to happen, or the goal where we're going is there, so I have a perfect particularity and a perfect universality from which has been eliminated, I shouldn't say, a perfect thirdness, a perfect intelligibility, from which the empty universality, which in American thought is the nothing in particular of the original generality, the unspecified generality. See, an empty universe is exactly what we're dreaming our way out of. Right? We're realizing a fully defined reality. That's the American idea. Okay, so at that point, it's not that the person is lost. The differences, you see, are not eliminated, but the only differences that survive are those differences that fit, as it were, the ideal system that is in the process of shaping itself and coming into being, right? So the end place is a perfect intelligibility, and a perfect intelligibility requires a perfect specification. The species is the middle term. You see, it's the formality without which there is no intelligibility, without which we're in the middle of nowhere. All right. So where is the person in Peirce? Ideally, the immortal person is that he uses the term. It's great. I love it. I actually looked it up just to refresh myself. I thought I knew what it meant. Right. He says that the immortal person is the one whose idiosyncrasy. You say idiosyncrasy, the idiosyncrasy of whom, right? And he doesn't use the word fit, but in effect, he does elsewhere. He has a metaphor. I have a couple of passages in mind. Actually, he does say somewhere this end goalpost that I'm talking about. It's great. I love it. He actually uses the term that the individuals will be welded together. Right? Do you understand? Now that's a great image because it says everything. In other words, welded together, no room to move now. So there's no more change in that ideal end. And yet, if you're going to weld, you've got parts there. Otherwise, you don't weld a blur. Do you see? So it's a frame, right, in which there's no room for movement any longer. Spontaneity has exhausted itself. Never will actually happen. I have to keep saying that. Never will happen. Don't worry about it. I don't want to distort purse, right? But the ideal, which will never actually be realized, will be an immovable permanence of intelligibility, the constituents of which, you see, will be welded together, but each of them will be what I'm calling a person, sans its error, its vanity, its, what's the other word? Its ignorance, you see, insofar as the idiosyncratic idea that the person is in purse is true, it's immortal, and it will be part of that mosaic. You see, it'll be a piece in that on that wall, right? That's right. Okay. So that's all about roundabout way of saying, shorthanded, that in purse, the person is other equal, the true person, as opposed to the self. You see, is the person who is equal to others, is an essential part of the picture, of the ultimate picture, right? And you can't be an essential part of the ultimate picture unless you're completely and fully real, right? And then, of course, you're completely and fully real. You are an eternal, immortal idea. So this is your shot. This is it, okay? But now notice, here's my point. This is mediated, my otherness, my participation in that immobile ultimate picture is mediated by mom and dad and by the generality of men. It's really a very scientific community idea, do you say? In other words, the truth here is the truth of the community, of the whole. And I have my place in that picture to the extent to which I fit into this general agreement. Not in the sense that I have nothing to contribute. I definitely do. I have something very definite to contribute, but it must fit with all the other pieces. Do you think? So the idiosyncrasy. When I looked it up again, right? I know that idio means private and so forth, but it means also proper. Speaking of appropriation, see? So it's and syncrasy is a mixing together, a mixing with, right? So it's a mixing with, but it's not a mixing with that eliminates the proper. Do you see? It's the mixing with other propers, right? Everything, right? All other, right? Everything fits together. Okay. So the thinking now occurring, it likes this part, but it doesn't like this part, because what it likes about Kierkegaard is this part. It likes the immediacy of the Kierkegaardian particular individual. It doesn't like its subjectivity. It likes the objectivity of the Persian individual or particular, but it doesn't like its being a product of mediation. So what you have here is a what? An other, equal, immediately so. Okay? And that's, I think, a little more, certainly historically, a little more concrete way of saying what I was trying to say 10 or 15 minutes ago. I don't know whether it has any bite or not. You'll have to tell me. But that's the flow of it. In other words, so that in the thinking now occurring, the individual person, or as it were, the individual thing, without getting into that question, whatever is real, a real entity in the long run, all right, is now understood for the first time to have a relation to others, but to have that relation, as it were, immediately, so that in the context of our discussion, the ultimate of that, the utter finality of that, is that there will be no reference, right? I want to say this, there'll be no reference to the relation. There'll be no need to relate it, because the immediacy will be perfect. The perfect immediacy of the otherness of the persons, the multiplicity of persons, you see, which also gets us beyond the welding idea, which is intrinsic to the American thought. It gets us, in that sense, beyond, I think, idealism. American thought is deeply idealistic. Peirce says as much. He has no problem with it. If somebody accuses me of idealism, that's fine by me, except that I hasten to add, we're never going to get rid of error and ignorance. Or another way of putting it is, yes, I am an idealist, but we're never actually going to arrive at the ideal. So that's the kind of idealism that American thought represents. And so in that sense, it appears not to be idealistic, because it appears to be, as Peirce thinks, realistic.
There's a later extension of this American concreteness and idealism that shows up so powerfully in 20th century American poetry in a certain branch. I mean, the beginning of William Carlos Williams Patterson with the great refrain, "Say it, no ideas but in things."
Yes.
So
yes. Now it's James. James says even more radical.
Yeah.
James says we should not talk about ideas in consciousness. We should only talk about things in consciousness.
Yeah. Now, this is my problem. That in moving from Williams through another poet, Charles Olson, who was my guy, my work on him and so forth, I've spent many years trying to think through the consequences of this poetics, which is a poetics of the concrete that remains a kind of idealism, but wants to diminish the question of systematicity in favor of the power of individual objects, the power of persons. And definitely, I mean, Robert Duncan says, my ideas, I take place out there. And in a personal note that I got from Olson, he said, the mortal makes the measure work. Where it all comes from, the outside, the garden. I got a little thing that he wrote to me, So I've been this is the actual key for why I actually was so powerfully attracted to the thinking now occurring, because I've already been thinking it. But these questions about how you actually, in all honesty, think about relations in relationship to that and systematicity never have resolved. I get the bite, but I don't get the argument.
Okay.
So I'm sorry if I'm imposing all of that.
You're not. No, you're not. I mean,
I'm looking for something. Actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll try and find it with you. But if we don't, or if we do, let me know.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's turn over to 344, which gets us back into gamma. And we got on to 345 last time, but I wanted to back up a little bit because it's something I noticed when I was preparing for last week's class. I didn't quite intend it, but that's even better. In the third line of the text on 344, with the bleeding of the Lamb there exists for the first time the infinity of the fact of being there in the form of man. Now, if I slow that down, it's the being there, the infinity of the being there. So if I translate it back into Heideggerianism, right, the thinking now occurring one way of understanding it is unlike the finite Dasein, you say, it's an infinite Dasein. And, you were talking about one of those poets telling you he was out there. Is that the expression?
Yeah, I take place out there.
I take place out there, right? Well, one of the expressions, again, I can't remember where this comes up. It may only come up, it comes up forcefully in Foundation. I speak of the thinking now occurring, the reality of it, as it were, as an absolute exteriority, all right? And, so if you want, coming back here, a being there, but infinitely being there, right? Or if you want, a being here, but an infinite being here, a being here without qualification, without, as we were saying last time, without a back door, without an exit prepared, right? Being fully and completely here. Yeah.
This brings up another whole piece of this as going through gamma. Your notion of four-dimensionality.
Right.
I mean, one aspect of a four-dimensional world would be that everything that you feel to be interior in the third dimension is actually on the surface of a fourth dimensional object.
Okay. All right.
So, I mean, am I?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. I would take it a little further. In other words, I would say that's a very good analogy. I would say, everything that in the three-dimensional world is on the inside is really on the surface. In the four-dimensional world, I just want to add to that conceptually. there's nothing but that surface, right? There's nothing but surface. There's nothing. So analogously, there's nothing but four-dimensionality. I mean, that's the ultimate reality.
Well, I mean, the idea is that really that if you can experience your interior as exterior,
right,
you are already in touch with the fourth dimension.
Okay.
Because that surface is a surface in the fourth dimension.
All right. Okay. Last time we did say, so I don't know if we have to go over it. Well, let's pick it up and then we'll go forward. Back on page 345. In the celebration of the infant Passover, the appearance of the Eucharist qua appearance is now seen for the first time in history to be itself the Eucharist in essence, to transcend appearance, to be appearance itself.
Where are we?
345, about 5 lines down, 5 or 6 lines down.
Okay.
That sentence at least. Then the next sentence after that, no longer are the elements on the table seen to be other than what they are in essence, namely the flesh and blood of God in the form of man. Dropping down another couple of lines to the italicized text. The appearance of the Eucharist transcends its being simply for others, not in being substantially different, as it appeared before now in the natural objectivity of a formally transcendental reason, which would be a reference in effect to Thomas, nor in being contingently different, as it appeared before now in the transcendental subjectivity of a purely natural faith, nor finally in being transcendently different, as it appeared before now in the formally transcendental thought of existence belonging in essence to reason. But now in being transcendentally different, it transcends the other in essence, so that it exists for others essentially identical with itself. They in turn, each with one another, identical in the form of man, with the Eucharistic essence of existence itself. This is the transcendent identity of an essentially transcendental thinking, in which transcendence itself is essentially transitive, that is, thought's new object. So one of the preliminary questions is transitive. A transitive verb. Let's start with this. A transitive verb, as opposed to an intransitive verb, has an object. So transitive, more generally, is it's the notion in transit, right? It goes across. It I would say here, it's I think probably the deeper meaning here, it's creative of its object, right? It goes across to its object. It's creative, essentially so. I just want to clarify the subject of that particular use of transitive here is what? Transcendence itself is essentially transitive, that is, thought's new object. So transcendent, this goes to the notion, which I'm not emphasizing here, but I think it's been emphasized in Alpha and Beta, and we've talked about it certainly at length, and it relates more deeply here. I gave you this back, but once you make this move, it's not just a reference back, so to speak, to these to make the distinction, but that the person in the thinking now occurring is other equal. That is, as we were saying, I think in recent classes, the identity of thought is the object. The object, right? And in that sense, as it were, the object providing thought's identity, in that sense, and in this case, the object, broadly speaking, is transcendence itself, right? Is the object, its thought's new object is transcendence itself. Transcendence itself is transitive, right? And essentially so here, in that it, as it were, goes across to and conveys to and constitutes thought's identity, right? Does that help?
That it not only takes an object, but it is its object.
What's
the
the
thought?
What's the
thought? The thought not only takes an object, but it becomes the object.
Yes.
It is the object.
Well, yes, or that there is no thought
left back there that corresponds to the object.
Not only left back there, but left back there, or there's no pre-existing thought, so to speak, right? So in a certain sense, there's no there's no thought as preconception. There is a phrase I use. I keep catching myself when I read. It's great reading your own stuff, right? And I found myself using the word preconception, and I thought, oh my goodness, there's no preconception thing now occurring. That was a mistake. But in the context, and I can't put my finger on the page now, the preconception in that particular passage, if you come across it, is referring to what is called here transcendence itself. So, in other words, if there is any preconception at this stage of the game, the preconception is not thought as preconception. It's the object is the preconception of thought, as it were. Okay. Okay. The bottom of the page, in this thinking, 6 lines up from the bottom of 345, in this thinking now occurring, there are no elements in essence apart from the elements of Christ. The appearance, now that's there's a certain productive ambiguity there, it seems to me, and that is the elements of Christ. We're here talking specifically about the elements of the Eucharist, okay? But of course, the elements of the Eucharist, qua Eucharist, are really no different than the elements of Christ, right? So one of the themes that struck, especially in today's reading, I think, is this Eucharistic essence of the universe, which would be another way of saying an essentially new universe. You could say the universe as Christ, or as in the latter part of today's assignment, the universe as church, right? So the church here in this context it's probably, well, it's certainly not identical with the Augustinian usage of the church, but it has something in common with Augustine's usage when Augustine in the City of God distinguishes between the visible and the invisible church, right? So it's a classic notion in Augustine, right, that in the visible church, meaning what we would call today the Church of Rome, in the visible church, the ecclesiastical institution with all its practice and rites and so forth and so on, liturgy, etc., in the visible church, Augustine wants to say, there are those who are members of the city of God, but there are also those who are not members of the city of God. If the visible church is the symbol, right? A symbol now for Augustine would be more than just an empty idea, right? If it is the symbol of the true church, of the invisible church on earth, Augustine wants to be very clear that not everybody who's in that visible church is in the true church, actually. But on the other hand, the corollary of that is that not everybody who's outside of the church, visible church, is not a member of the invisible church, right? So you can't tell from looking at the externals in that sense what the ultimate reality of who is really in and who is really out. You can't tell that, right? So Augustine at least got so far as to recognize what? Not that there is nothing but an absolute exteriority, but he got so far as to recognize that you can't make any simple distinction between inside and outside, right? You can't make any simple judgment about those matters. So what I'm saying here in general in Gamma is something along those lines, except that I want to say that the only thing I guess another way of putting this, shorthand, would be that the only way of thinking at this point in history, that is, the only way of truly thinking, is to think the universe as the church in this sense, which is at least analogous to the invisible church of Augustine, or as Christ, or as the Eucharistic elements, right? And that, now it's implicit here, and it's explicit in different ways at different places, and that there is a formal anticipation of this in Hegel's notion, which Kierkegaard is trying to exist as a concrete individual, in Hegel's notion of that a genuine knowledge of the world is the knowledge of its substantial divinity right? But in Hegel, that substantial divinity of the world, which would be his understanding of, it's really interesting, he actually speaks in Faith and Knowledge, in that text of his called Faith and Knowledge, he actually speaks of this is the thing that would drive Kierkegaard up the wall, of the eternal incarnation in man, right? And that is something of Hegel's idealism, and that's something of Emerson's idealism. Emerson's Americanized, pre-pragmatic generalization of that, Emerson, is that every man is the Word made flesh, right? Okay. With that qualification, nevertheless, Hegel understands that in some real, ultimately real way, the substance of the world is the divine being. You see, in the thinking now occurring, this is also true, but it's true in a intellectually, essentially new way. All right, and it's as if you could take something of Hegel, if you could get out of Hegel's thought the self-reference, if you could, as it were, explode the absolute logos of Hegel, the absolute idea. If you could explode it so that in some, but I mean absolutely explode it in such a way that the pieces were not little fragments of the idea, okay? An explosion which would be transformative, or maybe I would say transsubstantive, do you see, of what otherwise would be the pieces of an exploded Hegelian idea, right? So you have to be very careful with these metaphors, right? But if I explode the idea, and in the explosion I could transubstantiate the pieces as they fell, so to speak, through the void, right? As it were, right? Then I would have something like this perfect differentiation, you see, which has no trace, in which the pieces have no trace of their origin in an idealism. They've lost all, even the most infinitesimal reminiscence of being an ideally differentiated being.
No regime.
Okay. All right. Let's take a look at page 348. At the top of page 348, what now occurs in thought for the first time in history, transcending in fact the end of the world in essence, is the perception itself of the body. God and God in essence, the temple of the New Jerusalem, effected now in essence inclusively in the Missa Jubilaea, the center of an essentially new consciousness in the conversion of the universe into an entirely new stuff. And that use of stuff there is, I guess, kind of an American way to put it. I think it's also a Germanic way of speaking too. But it's very earthy, and it's meant to be so in a sense, right? An entirely new matter. Right? Later on in today's assignment, I noticed, I don't think I could just flip to it automatically, but there's a passage which interested me because when I was rereading it, the normal way, the normal movement, as I would imagine it, it's on page 354. Maybe just take a quick look at it. In the middle of page 354, the sentence that overlaps the middle of the page begins, "It is the preparation of the world's being for the absolute other being of life itself." Now there's an attempt to put in a phrase what I was talking about before, this absolute other being of life itself, in which the essential identity of Father and Son is shared without interruption of thought or will. So let me keep going. In which the two are wholly rooted as in the very joy of their existence. And so here it's speaking about the preparation, the thinking now occurring in a certain way, is the preparation of the world. And in that sense, it remains the beginning of the resurrection. It's the preparation of the world for its as it were, participation, which may not be a bad word now for the first time in history. It's participation in the Trinitarian unity, which is not a unity at the expense of differentiation, or however you want to put it, right? So the notion of the Trinity as the three and the one, where there is no substance attribute distinction, if I go back to Augustine, right? So that is the ultimate, that's the utter finality of the fact, in terms of which the thinking now occurring is the beginning of that realization. I mean, the realization of that fact, not the. It is already, as it were, we could call in the form of thought. It is the realization of that in the form of thought, but it is not. The form of thought remains to be so essentially. That is to be the fact. Period, as it were. Okay. The two are wholly rooted as in the very joy of their existence, in which they behold each the other as their absolute identity in being, absolutely different, without being other than the one God. Okay. The absolute difference of the Father and Son terminate. We're on page 354, in the bottom half now, bottom third actually, or a little below the bottom half. The absolute difference of the Father and Son terminates in this love, sprung from the essential identity of life itself, neither the one nor the other nor both, but a third in which the exaltation of the one God is complete, root and flower, the Spirit of God in whom, in fact, this Trinity is reflected, the very joy of God's existence, indeed, the very essence of God's unicity, through whom the world before now now is formally, and is to be materially identified with life itself in the form of the essentially new identity it has become in the course of time, namely the body itself or the temple of the Spirit, in which the historical structure of existence itself is reduplicated in the form of man. Now, as Chuck pointed out last time, in the thinking now occurring, and I don't know whether I want to try and go over that now, but maybe in effect I'm going to go over it, whether I want to or not, there is a kind of a new conception, a new understanding of history, right? And history now here is in some way radically distinguished from temporality or from time, and history is analogized to the moment, which is constitutive of reality, right? So in that sense, the image that comes to mind, I don't want to get hung up on images, but however, it's not bad here because you've got this threesome here. The only thing bad about this image is that it's too Neoplatonic. It's too hierarchical. All right, but let's risk it, and then we'll step on it. We'll just flatten it out. Okay. So if you start with your cone, so to speak, right? At the peak of this cone in this passage is the essence. Do you see? So the incarnation is that moment of the essential transformation of the world. Do you see? Which in the course of time becomes a formal transformation. Look at that in the context of this book and this course. Right? So something happens essentially. In Paul's language, there's a new creation. Paul didn't miss it. He didn't miss it. You see? But it didn't change the form. And he was perfectly willing to say that the form of the schema of the cosmos is passing away. Okay, but it didn't actually change the form of his thinking, qua thinker. You see? All right. So as we move down, or this is really a Persian image. Peirce likes this image. I mean, he uses it for his own purposes. So if I move from the apex of my cone or my triangle, depending whether you like 2 or 3 dimensions, as I move down, I'm actually things are broadening out. Right. In other words, I'm reaching right, a broader penetration, so to speak. That would be the way Peirce would be thinking. I think it's fair to say. And certainly it would fit here. Right. So in other words, the incarnation, the transcendental essence of existence appearing in time is the essential move. Do you say? A good example of the spread of that downward and outward simultaneously would be the transformation of thought, which comes to a head, so to speak, in a critical way in the thinking of Thomas Aquinas, and which is then further amplified in forms of essence to form to matter itself. So if you say that the incarnation is the, in some, well, hey, Ali was kind enough to give me a copy of Rilke's book, yeah, on the life of Mary, and if you look at the incarnation that way, then the penetration, it's not only that the Word became flesh, right, in the Annunciation, in the appearance of the angel to Mary, you see, but it, as it were, in becoming flesh, that essential moment, right, it is now clear that it, in some sense, it has become not just in certain sense the form of thought, you say, but it has become the form of a thought whose identity, we could say, is matter itself, right? In other words, so that not only did the Word become flesh, but we could understand at this point in time that the Word, in effect, has become matter itself, which is not to say that it has become, and this is key, not to say matter itself as an alternative to thinking, do you see, as an alternative to the formal. This is Peirce. I love him. I love these guys. They're really good. So Peirce, you see, his immortal person here, who is welded into that mosaic, on the unreachable mosaic, toward which, however, everything is approximating more and more over time, right? That existence for Peirce of the immortal person is, now here he's recaptured. He's recaptured. Oh, the Emersonian. Well, maybe. But both of them have recaptured the Augustinian notion of the symbol, to say, because for Peirce, the symbolic is not unreal. Right? The reality is a symbol, right? It's a living symbol, we might say, to be a little bit redundant in a Peircean world, right? But now here's the key. Here's the relevance of that. In Peirce, this symbolic reality. You see what the Americans do to guys like Hegel is they take the edge off. They just smooth it out. Don't be so universal. Be a little more generalizing, right? Okay. You got an absolute idea. Well, it's really what we mean is an absolute symbol. It's kind of like, it's not much different than an idea. You see? And Peirce will also use the word idea. Don't get me wrong. Okay, but I'm just making a point, right? In other words, so symbol is a little more compatible with the notion of never finally complete, but not necessarily by any means unreal, because reality for Peirce is never finally complete. So it is deeply symbolic, you see, and it's deeply the continuity in some way of what has gone before with what comes after, and so forth and so on. Okay. Anyway, but here's the point. Like Hegel, but a little less so, right? Because he's not like Hegel. He's different. Significantly different. Critically and crucially different at key points. Nevertheless, the symbol that I am, this idiosyncratic idea that I am, and that Chuck is, and that Alia is, and Todd is, all these idiosyncratic ideas, some of which may be destined to an immortality, be on the wall forever, okay, if you really got a good idea there, that you are. Nevertheless, this symbol, the nature of a symbol, says Peirce, is such that it is essentially not material. So the symbolic person in American thought is it's somewhat surprising to think, but right. But the deep idealism of American thought is that the immortality of the person, it's other equal, right? But it's not immediate. You see, it's mediated. It cannot be and be material. Right? Now you have to be very careful. To do justice to this guy, because he speaks of a friend of his he was talking to about what happens after death, and I forget whether it was his friend's conclusion or his conclusion. Oh no, it was a friend who. friend, I think, who lost his hearing, who went deaf, something like that. I may be making this story up. It doesn't make any difference. I think he says something like this. And he was surprised to find his friend playing music or listening to music or something. He was doing something. And he said to him, I thought, and he said something to the effect, well, no, I can hear the music, or I am playing the music. I can't remember the exact story. I'm able to do that because, although I didn't realize it when I could still hear, in a way, I was feeling or understanding the music beyond the hearing part, right? So the absence of hearing did not eliminate the experience of the music for the person.
Witness Beethoven.
Yeah. Okay. Now, but Peirce's intellectual point here is that death means the getting rid of the animal body, you see, and the spiritual existence is nevertheless not an existence devoid of all feeling, right? But it is not a material feeling, right? That's what I say. It's an ideal feeling, right? So why am I going to that? I think of that again because because of this passage here on 354. Because what's being said here is that the novation of existence, if I can use another term, essentially affected in the Incarnation, transformative of history, but immediately of history through the transformation of consciousness and thought over a period of a couple of thousand years, now reaches a point at which, right, it penetrates through and through, with the exception of not yet being the resurrection itself, let's say in all caps, but the beginning of the resurrection, it penetrates to matter itself, right? It transubstantiates matter itself, not just, right? So another analogy you could make here, and this is where Mary comes in, and this is in Rilke's little poem there on the Annunciation in this little book. He speaks of the angel gazing on Mary, and their gazes meet, and Rilke says something to the effect that, and then what millions saw, I don't know, it's hard to translate, right? Proposed or sought and underwent, was in them, in that union of the angel and Mary in that moment, right? So Rilke's seeing there in his way, speaking of the fact that in that moment was present, so to speak, the lives, the destinies, the being, the reality of, as he says poetically, millions, right? You could say everyone, right? All other human beings were affected by that moment, right? The thinking now occurring is saying yes, and you can see that in the history of thought, the history of social and political ideas, and so forth and so on, the geopolitics of the world, but more deeply than that, as deep as you can get, matter itself, right, is affected by that through and through, right? So the reason I thought to even turn to this page, which is I think deeply relevant to what we're right, was what struck me in a certain sense as the inversion, right, of our normal way of thinking, which then made me think of the difference from this Neoplatonic hierarchical way of imaging it, which is wrong. You see, it's wrong, but we're the victims of our lack of imagination. Is that in a Neoplatonic way, the direction would not be essence, form, matter. It would be, if there's any direction, right, in terms of if I can put it this way, an ideal direction, it's the flight of the alone to the alone. It's the removal, you see, which takes us in a certain sense back. And in this sense, there's a consistency between that if it's a mysticism, and Aristotle and Plato, who in their own ways, right, not absolutely and not simply and not uncomplicatedly, right, but ultimately found the ultimate reality either above and beyond, right, or behind, or out of reach, right, unremembered in Aristotelian terms. We don't remember. You say we forget here. In that sense, he remains a Platonist, right? But the incarnational movement, right, which is transformative of the world, is inconceivable without the reversal of that direction, which is inconceivable to a classical mind, right? But what I'm saying is that there's no limit to that reversal, right? That reversal actually is transforming. And so when my friend Jim, who's no, are you keeping the roll? Are you keeping the roll? Now, what was it? The objection. Now I lost it because I was of my joke. The reversal.
So the reversal is infinite.
Yeah, it's infinite. It's. Oh, yeah. He picked out a passage from somewhere. Actually, I put it on it's from Foundation because I put it on a couple of weeks back in response to something I was discussing with Chuck on the forum. Passage which I mentioned genetic engineering and stuff like that. All of these indicators, right? And Jim's point was, well, this is kind of modernity, really, not the thinking now occurring, right? But in this movement, fundamental movement, we are beginning to witness in these things, if you want, the signs of the truth of the fundamental notion the thinking now occurring is laying out, right? Kind of evidence out of the mouth of modernity itself, you see, of the maybe baby steps, right? But the real possibility of transforming what? The material universe, right? And it's not by no means simply a poetic or imaginary idea, right? Which is not to say that the way in which it's being done now is the last word, but it's again an indicator, and it's in that direction that things have been moving, right? So there is a movement here. The crossing through the threshold that I'm talking about in the thinking now occurring is not a denial of previous history. It's a radical, actual, it's a kind of living critique in thought of the self-restrictedness of previous thoughts in what is essentially perceived in the context of thinking now occurring in its being, especially in the case of modernity, a form of reaction to the incarnation. In its essence, it's reactionary insofar as it wishes to appropriate to itself, right, rather than to simply receive. So I think of the other thing about the image of the Virgin is the receptiveness. You see, and I think I make this point in the text here when I deal with it. Right, in other words, that the so-called I think Rilke used the word purity at some point. He must. But the purity of the Virgin is what? Is in a certain sense her being completely at the disposal of. Do you see? But somebody. So one of the other questions we have on the table is what's the difference between for another and at the disposal of another? To be for another sounds good, and I'm all for you and you're for me, and so forth and so on. But there's a limit to that, right? But in a deeper sense, the being for another is something short of the kind of complete and essential being which allows me, you could say, in effect, in some practical sense, to be for another, but to be for another deeply at the disposal of another. In other words, not having my being depending upon that, which we were talking about at the beginning of the class, on the relationship to the other. So in other words, being at the disposal of another attempts to suggest something of the faith, do you see, that the faith that is required in acting without, ultimately, not only without self-reference, you see, but also in a certain sense without reference to the relationship between the other, right? To be at the disposal of the other is a statement of the freedom of an actual completely existing otherness, a kind of perfect freedom in the relation, as it were, between others. And maybe so, putting it that way, I would say that the missing links in the distributed, discontinuous circle, right? What's missing there is the being for another, right? The dependence of one point upon the preceding or following point, the dependence that's involved in Peirce's notion of the role of the symbol, right? The dependence. So when I say that the screen has been removed in the camera image, right? The schema has been removed. There is that immediacy in which the transcendence itself is the object of actual thought. That immediacy of the object as the actual identity of thought is just a certain context in which the relationship between the completely free beings in that essentially distributed circle. It's just another way of characterizing the relationship between those essentially free beings as being as being not an ideal relationship, not a symbolic relationship, not a representational relationship, not a needing to be related in order to be this other. Do you see? Not an immediate otherness, right? Well, if I have my otherness immediately in my very being, and absolutely so, then and only then am I able to be simply at the disposal of another. That is, only in that way can I be simply free in my dealings with others, right? And in that sense, and then I want to say, and then in that sense, objective. In other words, danger, misreading, right? Is because Peirce, I love him. I just love him. He's got all these bases covered, right? And so he says, what I want to say here, I didn't say it, but let me just say. So here, notice I have a 3 here too. And so one way of understanding Peirce in the thinking now occurring is that, I do this in Foundation in section 4.1, where I'm discussing American thought and relating Peirce to Hegel and Kant in a way which is at least as difficult as this book, I guess. And in that section, I introduced the notion of fourthness, which really would have, Kierkegaard's up the wall every time you say, say Hegel. But fourthness was a kind of bugaboo for Peirce. Because Peirce had firstness, he had secondness, and he had thirdness. And he does admit that he was tempted over the years, because he always was reviewing his thought. In other words, a great thing about his thought, which is not just a person, well, yes, it is a personal idiosyncrasy in the best sense of the word of Peirce, but what in the normal sense of the word, it's not just a personal idiosyncrasy, it's part and parcel of pragmatism, right? That it is profoundly tentative, and therefore of itself, it's always potentially calling itself into question. Anyway, so as part of that, concretely, he had to wonder every once in a while during his life whether or not there might actually be a fourthness. I mean, what? And he finally convinced himself. I think he finally convinced himself that no, there is no fourthness. Right? Now, the reason I'm saying that is that in this 1, 2, 3, in this orience, this firstness, this spontaneity, this sheer feeling, right, which is so perfectly such that it has in itself no relation to anything else or no relation to itself. Right? And of course, it's like that Aristotelian now that we were talking about many weeks ago, right, where you can't grasp it, right? Well, that's firstness for Peirce, but of course for Peirce, that's where it all begins, right? That's the soup out of which begins the bubble, right? This is the non-specific. This is, if you want, a kind of, and not unreal. It's a kind of sheer generality in a certain sense. I have to be careful here. Or put it this way: sheer generality at the beginning of it is like sheer firstness, right? It has the quality of firstness, and then things become actualized, right? From that sheer possibility and that secondness, and then the habit-taking tendency kind of perpetuates, organizes, and builds up, right? And so you have that 1, 2, 3 in the context that we were just talking about on another page. In Aristotelian thinking, now occurring terms: essence, form, matter, right? Okay. So to make this move beyond Peirce, which the thinking now occurring does in effect, involves, as Foundation points out, an understanding that there is a category, with all due respect to Peirce, of fourthness. Right? Now, what Peirce says in his phenomenology, which is what we're really talking about when we talk about firstness, secondness, and thirdness in Peirce. In other words, these are the three and the only needed three. There might have been a fourth that we needed to throw in there, but then we decided no. With these three categories, we can understand how it is that anything appears in consciousness. Okay? And it appears in consciousness and is understood to be there in terms of these three categories, and no others are needed. That's basically what Peirce is saying. So that you could say, and Peirce does say in effect, that in consciousness, if I can do this right, in consciousness, these three are, in a certain way, you could say, let me see if I can remember the passage. Yeah. In a moment of consciousness. In other words, the thing has got some levels. In a moment of consciousness, which moment of consciousness, it gets a little complicated, okay? The moment of consciousness has the quality of firstness. Right? It's the now. And that now of consciousness, there's nothing to hang on to. There's no form yet. Right? It's pure quality, and therefore that accounts for the fact that I can't grasp it. I can't retain it. In a certain sense, I can't see it until it's too late. It's gone. I always see it as it were in the past. Then I objectify it. But that's not the actual moment of consciousness. Peirce is quite clear on that. Okay. But what he does say, here's what interests me. In that moment of consciousness, the three categories in some way are present together. Okay? Or put it another way, in that, we were talking in an earlier class, in the thought that, as it were, I abstract from the continuum of consciousness and the thought of a moment of consciousness, as it were, which I cannot grasp in isolation, in Peirce. In that moment of consciousness, in that thought, these three categories are together. They are unified together. Right? I cannot, in the moment of consciousness, I can't segregate them out, right? Because the moment of consciousness, he says, has no parts. Okay? Because his more precise language, I can't analyze that moment, because to analyze something, I need to, well, not only need time, which is one side of the issue, but I also need to be able to analyze it. I have to take it apart, right? Reduce it to its part, decompose it in some sense. See? All right. Now, Peirce is willing to say that in this moment of consciousness, I would say, not in the passage, he doesn't use the language, but I think he's talking about the same thing. In a thought, there are together these three things that cannot be taken apart, cannot be analyzed, but they are there. I can do an analysis, but then I need time, and in that sense, I'm already beyond the moment, right? But nevertheless, he affirms, as it were, that the three things are there as one in this moment of thought. Now, I think I've already said, in the thinking now occurring, it's as if we have broken through, we have chopped up the otherwise continuous circle, the continuity of thought, the continuity of time, or time as a continuum, right? And our thinking in the now occurring, thinking in the now occurring. Right? There is thought there is thinking, as it were, going on in that actual now, is what the thinking now occurring is all about. Okay? And therefore, okay, so here is my most recent thought when I was putting together this analysis. The fourthness becomes well, now I'm starting to think of the fourth dimension, right? It becomes like a higher level. I'm speaking loosely here, just to try and. It's against my principles to really communicate, but.
Give it a whirl.
The fourthness becomes a higher level firstness, right? A higher order of, you see, a higher level of simplicity, so that now we could say, in a way that's formally consistent with Peirce, do you see? That in the thinking now occurring, right, as this higher level firstness, this higher level of immediacy, you see, there are present three categories. Now, of course, they're not exact, right? They're going to be transformed, because once you do this, you put them in a new environment, and they're going to take on. So they're no longer going to be the simply irreducible to one another trinity of Peirce, category of Peirce, trinity of categories of Peirce, but they're now going to be discrete, fully discrete, but existing together in the unity of the thinking now occurring. And that overarching unity is this fourthness, which has the quality of a higher order of firstness, you see, and contains, as it were, within itself, as its constituents, you see, perfectly discrete categories, or the equivalent, perfectly discrete equivalents to, or of, or analogs to, maybe better, the Peircean three categories, right? And that comes out in the what I call real trinary logic, you see, as opposed to the ultimate dualism of Peirce's triad. Okay, so now why did I want to do that? Oh, because this is what I thought what Peirce said that was really interesting. See, so when Peirce is talking about firstness, this is not a put down, because without firstness there ain't no second, there ain't no thirdness. Okay, without the pure, as it were, pure, unspecified, as it were, general, right? See, this is the point of contact with Hegel. See, because Hegel's absolute idea is, what's it doing? You pardon the pun. It's no pun. It's generating the world, right? And so this is the generator, right? This is the the firstness is the generator, but to be a really good generator, right, it can't be anything specified. It can't be anything generated, right? Okay. Plotinus hasn't gone all together all the way. See? Okay. So he says of firstness, or this pure quality of the category of firstness, that it is, how does he put it? It's powerless to affect anything. It's powerless to affect anything. Okay? Now that's paradoxical given what I just said. Okay. But because it's sheer possibility, you see. And so the generator generates by just being this perfect, pure quality of possibility. And what could you say? I mean, given enough possibilities, something's got to happen, right? Something. And that's basically the way he thinks, right?
So this is unspecified possibility as a principle.
The possibility, yeah.
The possibility of possibilities, as it were.
Well, yes, because you have in mind in the second possibilities there's something particular. Yeah. This is the sheer possibility.
It's a whole modality of being that's different from determinate factuality.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But it is that without which there would be no such determinate reality, and it is that from which, in some you have to understand, totally unpredictable way, by chance. By chance. This is another reason why Peirce is deeply consonant with quantum mechanics, you see. The probability, I mean, he was very interested in probability theory, mathematically, and so forth, you see. So, but, I mean, it's all the deep consistency of his thought. So the origin of the world, the generator of the world, is such that what happens, what follows from it in the way of secondness, happens by chance. Okay, now, sheerly, all right, so the reason I'm bringing this up is by way of I'm trying to be pragmatic, I'm trying to be self-critical. That's it. Should be self-critical, I should be other-critical. I'm trying to raise an objection to the thinking now occurring, so as to say something about the thinking now occurring. So even if Peirce were here and was willing to play along with the temptation to think that there was a fourthness, which was a kind of higher level firstness, his retort would have to be, well, okay, if I grant you that, you've only got one problem, that you have a higher level of powerlessness to affect anything. You have, you see, and I want to say that the thinking now occurring, in a certain sense, accepts that. You see, in other words, so at that point, in other words, if consciousness is this fourthness, right, which is constitutive of reality in a way absolutely unprecedented in the history of thought, it must be, and maybe we can kill a couple of birds with one stone here, it must be a higher level, so to speak, of what would be in Peirce a higher level of possibility, you see, of sheer possibility. So when we speak in this context here of the nullification and the annulment, right, of possibility, right, then in the thinking now occurring, and by the way, this goes hand in hand in the text with the annulment of faith itself. So if speaking, I think it's fair to say, speaking here a Hegelian language, and the way to distinguish this, therefore, from the Hegel whose language it is, so to speak, speaking, just as you could say, I'm in the process of trying to dissociate or distinguish this from the elements in the thinking that remind one of what Peirce thinks. Okay. The key thing in the annulment, the use of annulment in Gamma, that distinguishes it from the use in Hegel, is that it's characterized here as an absolute annulment. By which I mean to suggest that in a way like in Hegel, in this case, coming back to where I started with the fourthness, in a way like in Hegel, this higher order, as it were, of possibility, of sheer possibility itself, has no truth of its own. If I put it in Hegelian language, it has no truth of its own. Its truth, therefore, has to be, to go back to simple terms earlier in the book, has to be the creation and the incarnation. That the truth has to be a God who is absolutely other than it. You see? So, in other words, we'll put it more simply, so that this situation in which transcendence itself is the essentially new identity of thought in essence is an absolute giftedness, right? And an absolute receptivity. And therefore, to go back to my original objection that I'm posing in the midst of this, a kind of Persian-like objection, a kind of infinite, a possibility more perfect, as it were, than the simple firstness of Peirce, a possibility that is in which what happens is not understood to be happening as a matter of chance, but out of the possibility of this higher level, which is a possibility which has been absolutely annulled. Right? In other words, I could, to do it quickly, absolutely reconstituted. Do you see? As a kind of absolute giftedness, what comes to be. What it comes to be is, in some sense, not simply a matter of chance, but it is created by, or in the language of the text, often is the construction of this perfectly new consciousness. So to put it a little more simply, what otherwise would be. In American thought, which continues, although it ideally, you see, it's very interesting that all those pieces in the ultimate ideal mosaic are selfless. They belong there because they are the particulars who have, from whom all error and all self-consciousness has been eliminated, who have made the great sacrifice. Peirce is very good. He says somewhere, he talks about, I don't know what the heck he's talking about. He's talking about mankind. And he says, I'm going to forget my point. I hope I don't. I'll keep my finger here and my hand over there. He says, people think that men are selfish, meaning mankind. Not half as selfish as we think. If we were that selfish, why would we be concerned about, exhausting the resources of the planet and life of generations to come? So we're not going to be around. In other words, that it's deep in us to be unselfish, right? Despite the fact that, right? And so ideally we define ourselves in terms of the interests of others. That's the ideal. That's Jesus is Jefferson, or Jefferson is Jesus, and so forth and so on. Okay. Now, see if I can recapture this point. So I was saying, so here we have a fourthness, which is constitutive, creative, constructive of its reality. I think I've forgotten my original point, but I'll bring it back in another way. That selflessness, which is the ideal of the welded together immortal individuals who are, in a certain sense, pure particulars who happen to fit the ultimate totality of things that is never actually arrived at because of the continuing reminiscence of generality, to bring that forward, right? In other words, to de-idealize it, right? To make the absolute now, which is now configured in terms of this fourthness that I've tried to articulate in the context of the three categories, to bring, as it were, that future absolutely into this now. That is, in that sense, in the absolute now, to cut out the future possibility. Maybe that's a way of bringing it around. Okay, the future possibility, and make the possibility absolutely the possibility that is here and now, you see, for which, to go back to another theme we were striking in another context another day, for which we are, here and now, perfectly responsible, right? And are beginning to actually realize more and more concretely the effectiveness of our responsibility. So where I was going, so my original objection was, so this powerlessness of the sheer possibility. So another way. So by bringing the end post here. Go back to what is the unum? I said the other day, in some way or another, it's the incorporation of what otherwise remain outside of the middle in Peirce, the incorporation of the beginning and the end. The beginning and end are here and now, in some sense, you see, unified in this absolute now of consciousness. And in that situation, the distinction, the higher level of possibility is indistinguishable from an actuality, do you see, which in one sense simply exists here and now, but in another sense, or simultaneously as it were, right, is our doing, is in effect, is in effect what we affect. That's an accident, but it might be helpful. In other words, a kind of absolutely all-embracing possibility as a kind of absolute giftedness is effectively, granted, sheer possibility is powerless to affect anything, right? But in this higher level sense, it affects our effectiveness, right? And that's the giftedness, right? It brings it about that in effect, as the effect of an absolute other, we are where we would otherwise expect where we'd otherwise expect to be powerless to affect anything. We, in a certain sense, are powerless to affect everything. Powerful.
Yeah.
Powerful to affect everything, in principle, right? And go back to the theological analog, which is discussed with all the references to the resurrection. You see, if in the resurrection itself we get to that level of otherness where not even the lingering reference to the other is required, a kind of absolute concretion of otherness, analogous to the divine simplicity, right? A kind of utter finality of the absolute simplicity arrived at. Well, that has got to be, in effect, right, a perfect participation in the creation of the world, right? And the analog to this, go back to Thomas, who's always good, Touchstone. The analog to this is, that I mentioned it in a totally different context earlier in the course, is that when the divine omnipotence. The divine omnipotence is metaphysically making a world where there's neither, not only not form, that's not new, but there's no potentiality. There's no matter, metaphysical matter. There's no possibility, no potentiality, no nothing. God makes the totality of the world in creating ex nihilo, metaphysically. But the interesting point was that Thomas said, in another passage, but the chief way in which God is omnipotent is not that. He doesn't make a direct comparison. But the chief way is the divine mercy. Well, mercy is effectively not exercising any power. I mean, it's restraint. In other words, it's not doing anything. I mean, what does mercy mean? I let you go. I acquit you. Right? I don't hold you. I don't put you in jail. Right? So what I'm trying to get at is that. But I want to make this historical. In other words, I don't want to say that. That's an interesting analogy. I want to say that. It's telling because what I'm saying in effect is the thinking now occurring, the metaphysics and the mercy are not two different ways of understanding the creation. They're not separate, or you see, they're not different. Mercy for Thomas, mercy is the chief expression of the divine omnipotence, and the metaphysical power would be what? It would be the secondary, it'd be the henchman, the lieutenant way of expressing it. You see, so here with the simplicity of the thinking now occurring is that faith and knowledge, you see, are essentially identical, and therefore the powerful expression of omnipotence is identical with this fourthness, which is the real intellectual analog of what was seen in a kind of pre-Kantian moral way as a divine mercy. If you understand what I'm saying, it was seen in terms of forgiveness of sin and so forth and so on, which is all fine, you see. But the forgiveness of sin is anticipating a kind of moral faith in Kant, as over against this scientific realm in Kant, right? So if Peirce, and he was sincere, and Whitman and all these guys, if they were looking for the one-ment in the long run of science and religion, the thinking now occurring has understood it in principle to be, in some sense, here and now in consciousness, as a done deal, so to speak. Something like that. You going to say something?
I was going to hazard a couple of analogies that seem too apt to not introduce.
Okay.
One is what really goes on in the really, really refined Taoist martial arts masters, in which everything is affected by doing nothing.
Okay.
The mastery of a form. I've studied some of this. I don't by no means a master, but enough to get a taste of it in the game of martial arts called push hands, where you basically you're just trying to knock a guy over. But to the degree that you identify with your own effort to knock him over, their opponent perceives that and completely empties himself of his own intention and identifies with yours, and the thing goes immediately right around and you knock yourself over. And that really is a very practical study of this. That you think you're not moving, the other guy who's more sensitive than you are picks up your motion and completely releases into it, so that your motion can complete itself. Only goes in a circle and knocks you down. When they use the swords, the sword is this thing that's other than me. And you learn so that the sword is a complete extension of your own sensibility. But the purpose of that is not like you're magically extending yourself into the sword. It's to experience your own being as other, as the sword. And the degree to which you can do that, you're completely open and responsive to what's happening. And the other analogy that is a Tibetan term, what they usually translate it in this weird way as skillful means of what the bodhisattva, how the bodhisattva accomplishes his compassion for other beings. It has to do with utterly giving up any kind of preconception or premeditation of what that action is, and the absolute identification of one's own total situation with the situation that one's in, so that appropriate action takes place through an utter simplicity. That's an utter emptying out of. It's not like there's no stuff going on in here. It's that one doesn't think of what's going on in here as mine. It's just part of the circumstance. So I just thought to put those in there.
Okay.
Chuck, could I just ask you something or add something in it? In saying identification with the other, it's like a metaphysical identification as opposed to a psychological.
But yeah, it's certainly not an
Because
ordinary psychological one.
Yeah, because in there's sort of three levels of compassion that go with that which makes me think of the word mercy here again. Is that deepest level has nothing to do with empathy. It's not. It's a kind of
in a psychological sense.
metaphysical identification in the sense of emptying out completely.
No question.
All right, let me see here. Oh, predicament. We have to do predicament. So let's go to 350.
350.
I think it's 350. I'm trying to find it on the page.
You use the word actually repeatedly.
Yeah, I do, but there was a particular.
Here it is, the essential predicament on 350.
10,
Yeah.
12 lines from the bottom.
Oh, yeah, I see it. Okay. So let's start maybe around the middle of the page. In the middle of that, well, let's start with the parenthesis. In this thinking now occurring, there is neither the embarrassment nor the encumbrance, neither the essential nor the formal limitations of previous thought. The limitation of this essentially new form of thought is purely material. Now, of course, you see, that's in the context of everything we've been saying. That limitation is the freedom of this form of thought, right? The proclamation in essence of the word, the missa jubileia, the body itself. The subtitle, I wrote this book Foundation, and I found myself giving this tentative title, Foundation, Matter, the Body Itself, and I still don't like it. But I couldn't change it, and I thought that was interesting.
You better like it. I mean, it's too weird for it not to be what you intend there.
Well, no, but the point I'm trying to make is that aesthetically, I would have liked something different or better, but it was right. In other words, I had no choice. And so, and when I reread this part of Novitas Mundi, I mean, I understand why I really had no choice, right? Because this perfectly differentiated matter is another way of speaking of the body itself, right? The distribution of the elements, of the Eucharistic elements, right? As the constituent pieces of a universe that are no longer reminiscent of what would have been in a previous self-consciousness an explosion of the absolute idea. Those points, those pieces, are the constituents of the body itself. In the Missa Jubileia, the appearance itself on page 350 of the Eucharist is affected in substance. The substantial transaction of the Mass is the proclamation of the Word in essence. It is the body itself, the substantial reflection of the change itself of the universe now beginning for the first time in the form of a thought itself caught up in the essential predicament of existence itself. Now, I like the word predicament because it's a little bit playful. I mean, it's not really playful, it's probably not the right word, but it's punning a little bit. The strict technical meaning of predicament is it's a Latin translation into English of the Greek for category, right? So its technical meaning is you could say that it's a thought caught up in the essential category of existence itself, and that's certainly touching on it. Maybe another way, and maybe not as perfect a way of saying, but in effect, it's like what I was talking about before when I was talking about a new category of fourthness, right? And that higher order level of a possibility which, in effect, as an effect, is effective of the world here and now, in which spontaneity and a kind of perfect particularity are no longer poles apart, but have been unified Oh, another point I wanted to make when I was doing that whole thing, it would come back here, the predicament, have been unified not as those three Persian categories are unified in his phenomenological analysis of consciousness. Yes and no. Here, unified in this higher level of spontaneity, right, of possibility, not in a consciousness opposed to or distinguished from an always out of reach object, you see, but now unified in the consciousness, the very identity of which is the object. So you could say, to make it vivid, right, that the unity of the categories and the fourth category in which these three other categories are constituent, perfectly discrete elements in the unity of one thing, is a consciousness in which the unity of the one thing is not a unity of consciousness that is in touch with the object, always somewhat out of reach, you see, but in which the identity of that consciousness, which is so constructed, is the object, right? So in other words, the category of existence itself, again, connotes something of what was in that phrase, where transcendence itself is essentially transitive, right, to what now actually is thought, or yeah, okay. Okay. So dropping down to the italicized language, what now occurs is not the elemental reconstruction of the world in the image of a mere man. Now that's a kind of indirect reference to what begins with Descartes, the Meditations through Hegel, as was the case with modern thought from its very inception, nor the perception of the world as a mere appearance. What now occurs, which is a kind of Hegelian, well, depending on, I mean, you could parse it out in a number of ways, certainly Hegelian and Kantian. What now occurs for the first time in history is the elemental reconstruction of the world essentially in the image of God. It is the in the tradition, of course, they're always looking. Augustine was keen on this. This was very important to him in his project on the Trinity. He started with what was near at hand. Right? So he ultimately wants to have some understanding of the triune God, but he starts, and this also Thomas picks this up. But Thomas absolutizes this move, which in Augustine is a little freer, a little less rigid. But Augustine, quite properly, so to speak, begins with what is near at hand. In other words, he looks for the images of the Trinity in nature, right? So he first looks outside to see the images, and then ultimately he looks inside. First he looks even at he looks, a really interesting passage in the Trinity where he looks at the bridge. In other words, how is it the mind, how does the external object, as it were, get into the mind, right? And that turns out to have a Trinitarian structure in which the middle ground, the middle term, should be the thirdness, so to speak, which theologically would be the place of the Spirit, the union of the Father and the Son. That middle ground is kind of a black box for Augustine. In other words, it's a kind of, he loses that one. He knows it's there, but you don't see it, and that kind of explains why we have a pretty good idea of who the Father is, and we have a pretty good idea of who the Son is, but this Holy Spirit guy has always been kind of nebulous, right? Okay. And so he sees that even reflected in the way in which the mind, in his psychology, his technical psychology, works, rational psychology, I guess we would say, works. Anyway, and Thomas picks up the notion that God is seen. Thomas is very clear on the fact, this is also very interesting, that I don't think I mentioned it explicitly. Thomas, if you read Thomas, just read Thomas. It's unequivocal. It's unequivocally the case that we have no essential understanding of God. Right? There is, we have no knowledge of God in essence. Now, we do have an analogical way of knowing God, but the essence of God is completely beyond us. Now, of course, fortunately, if we go to heaven, God's going to remedy that. It's going to superimpose a form on our natural form, which will enable us to be united with him. Otherwise, we do not have it within our capacity. But Thomas, so you can see the modern world coming along here, which was not the case in Augustine. But anyway, the point making. But nevertheless, with those qualifications, both Augustine and Thomas, in their own way, understood that the only knowledge we have, not the only knowledge, not for Augustine, the only knowledge we have, as it were, in this life for Thomas, and certainly the beginning knowledge that we have in this life for Augustine, is through our knowledge of the sensible world and our experience of the sensible world, right? And in the thinking now occurring, what that turns out to be is no longer an alternative, right? That in real sense, you say, you could do it this way if you wanted. This is a little bit arbitrary, but it makes some kind of sense. I mean, you could say, okay, Tom, that's Tom Aquinas, although you could say, well, the only knowledge we have in this world is of material entities. But you could agree with Augustine that it's possible to get some understanding beyond the limitations of matter in Augustine. But in the thinking now occurring, you don't have to either, as it were, make that choice. In other words, what is being said here, and said more explicitly even, I think, it's said in its own way here, but there's a lot of theological overlay here, so it's not said as baldly as it is in Foundation, right? And in Faith and Philosophy, it's said again, right? That really omnipotence, the omnipotence of God is now sensible. I mean that, right? I guess I mean that every possible way it could be meant, right? But certainly in this context, it is sensible. It is material. It's that alternative no longer exists, right? So in that sense, it's a transubstantiation, or a substantial transaction goes on in thinking now occurring, by means of which matter is not in any way whatsoever. In fact, quite the contrary. So you could say that the revelation, right, the apocalypse, right, the revelation of the divine takes place in our sensible experience, qua sensible, right, or qua immediate sensible reality is not an alternative. Okay. A couple of. Okay, let me take a look at 354. Well, let me just quickly on 352 at the bottom. The restriction on that thinking now occurring, right? So this. What restriction is there on the thinking now occurring? We really already covered this, but I just want to point it out in the text. Referring here, therefore, to that remaining difference, if I can put it that way, between the beginning of the resurrection and the resurrection itself in its utter finality, right? So is there some restriction here? Yes, but it's, while essentially not the self-restriction of that thinking belonging in essence to the past, is nevertheless the restriction of the other, all right? So that there is an other restriction is a way of pointing to the fact that we were talking about earlier, that there is in some sense, although it's not in any self-conscious sense, there is nevertheless in the thinking now occurring an understanding, an essential understanding of a not yet, right? But a not yet which is not an alternative, right, to an absolute now, right? So it's that kind of, if you want, difficulty, but it's an important distinction, I think, to note. All right.
You can see the writing on the wall.
Okay. Okay. All right. So another way of talking about what I was talking about a moment ago, I speak on page 356. about 10 lines or so down, this perception itself is implicitly the complete exaltation of being itself, in which matter itself is to be itself exalted, is to cease to be in essence apart from being in essence identically the transcendental substance, appearance itself transformed in essence. In this thinking now occurring for the first time in history, the universe itself in essence is transformed into being, qua substance, the essentially transcendental identity of the body itself of God, he ecclesia catholike. All right, so literally the Catholic Church, but again in this sense of analogous to Augustine's use of the notion of the invisible church. Right, the church here, Catholic, as I think I pointed out to you in an earlier context, Catholike from the Greek meaning, as Quintilian translated it, universal and perpetual. Right? So, in which, in effect, the distinction between the breath and the when I'm doing this paper, I found myself using a term which I kind of like, but I'm testing it out. This absolute now is like the absolute abbreviation of time. Right? So the unum is a kind of absolute abbreviation of time, but an absolute abbreviation, the briefest time, right? Including what otherwise would be all time, extensively, right? And in that sense, Catholike. You see, in that sense, the universe in each part. Okay, and then let's take a look at the text on annulment and nullification on page 361. On page 361, maybe 10 or 11 so lines down. Speaking of, the text is speaking of Christ himself. Before now, he existed essentially in the form of the presupposition of the appearance of the transcendental essence of existence itself. He existed in the form of faith itself, understood to be, in the transcendental consciousness of the church, transcendent qua appearance. He was understood to be substantially immanent in the form of a complete change of the elements of this world, elements otherwise existing in time and space in more or less specific locations. All right, so if you focus in for a moment on the mass idea here, the role of the mass in this analysis, the doctrine of transubstantiation, as Thomas lays it out, is that the bread and wine are transubstantiated, and then you have a kind of, what you might call a kind of inconsequence in the understanding, and it's the inconsequence is just an extension of the notion of miracle to cover the inconsequence, right? In other words, here we have the body and blood, but down the block or around the corner in the other church, we have it there too. But since we only have it in these various tabernacles around town, around the country, around the world, in all of these places, but we don't have it in between. You see, right? In other words, it's literally, talk about out of the box, okay? It's literally the consecration, the consecrated elements, the transubstantiation, do you see, is contained in a box. Right? It's boxed. And it's an inside-outside. It's a wall that separates what's true inside this box from what is true outside of the box. There are lots of boxes, so you don't have to worry.
It's an ancient idea of a temple.
Yeah, right.
Where you created something that's in distinction from the rest of the world,
right.
that holds the sacred.
The temple is a schema of the world.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's interesting to read Paul in that context. Yeah. The schema of this world is passing away. Yeah. The temple is passing away. Yeah. Right? Okay. So then the world becomes, well, see, it's a little misleading, but the world becomes the temple. I mean, in the sense that the temple
the fulfillment.
Yeah, a temple that isn't the temple. I mean, right? Okay. Okay. What's our place?
Core appearance.
Middle of 361.
Yeah, I know that, but I can't find the exact place. I'll back up to where I think I can get going again. This possibility annulled in the absolute. Oh no, I'm on the wrong page.
361.
Yeah. Okay. So before now, Christ existed inessentially, that is, unchurched, in the form of the ideal of an intellectually desperate faith bereft of faith itself. You could take that specifically as a reference to Kierkegaard in the context of everything, in his context, intellectual context. This faith, just so, was precluded from understanding itself in essence. Now, Christ himself exists in essence for the first time in history in thought itself, in the form of the annulment of faith itself. And again,
you're using annulment as some kind of Aufhebung, in your sense of Aufhebung.
I am.
Yeah.
I am. Yeah. So I kind of are reconstituting a reduction to nothing of faith,
in order to it become faith,
so that it is reconstituted. The truth of faith, right, becomes now the truth. You could say the truth of possibility in this text. You see, and more broadly, comprehensively, it becomes the truth of thinking, right? That faith thinks for itself, as I say here, and that's a repetition of what was said in an earlier appendix in Beta, I think, right? Okay. He exists in essence in the conception of the body itself, the appearance itself of which is transcendentally distinguished from its substantial existence qua matter as not yet conceived in essence, so that the substantial existence of the body itself is materially intelligible in the form of this thought, now fact evidently existing for the first time in history, although not yet is it absolutely, qua matter, the transcendental essence, creation itself. The annulment of faith, the only difference being, again, that subtle, perhaps all too subtle difference between the perfect otherness now actually existing in thought and the resurrection itself, in which, how can I say, no mention need be made of that. No adverting to the reality will be necessary, right? That utter finality, if you want, of essential otherness. The annulment of faith itself absolutely coincides with the nullification of possibility itself. This absolute coincidence is the thinking in which, for the first time, faith thinks for itself, in which thought hears the word for itself. So that's a kind of parallel, right? In other words, faith thinks for itself, and thought hears the word for itself, right? So it's a kind of mutual interpenetration, if you want, of the two notions. And it reminds me of something that it becomes central in faith and philosophy. A passage in Augustine in his treatise on the predestination of the saints, which was alluded to by John Paul in the encyclical Fides et Ratio, but I mean he alludes to the treatise, but he doesn't quote the passage that I quote in Faith and Philosophy, in which Augustine, I mean, the more I think about it, the further his reach goes, right? And Augustine has just a little simple passage, it would seem, in which he's talking about the relationship between faith and thinking. And he makes the simple observation, he does it very neatly, and I can't do it from memory. But the basic observation is that there is that you can't separate the two, that there is no faith without thinking, right? But it kind of really is kind of a deep spiritual anticipation of the methodology of Descartes, right? There is no faith without thinking, but then how does he put it? The sufficiency, speaking of a word we haven't used in a while, the sufficiency of thought is God. Okay? So it reminds me of Descartes. Descartes thinks, and he finds that he thinks first, then he thinks of God. But when he thinks of God as that cause of his being, a thinker, without which, right, so in a certain sense, he closes a circle there. And that circle, in its own way, is found in Augustine. So, again, in Augustine, there's a very clear precedent, at least, in principle, for what now becomes what I call here an absolute coincidence of faith and thinking in the thinking now occurring, in the form of the thinking now occurring. But it's, as I say, it's not totally unprecedented, and Augustine is a place to look for a precedent, or something like a precedent. Okay, well, we pushed the clock, so I'll stop. We got a little more done than last time, which is good. Our next time is our last meeting, and yes.
Two hopefully short questions.
Sure.
Communion of saints. Is community of saints or communion of saints?
Both are used. Both are used.
So